Hello, I'm Steve Barron, and today we discuss direct democracy with Mr. Colin Craig, leader of the New Zealand Conservative Party. First of all, could I ask why New Zealand needs more direct democracy? Why do we need binding referendums?
Well, I think New Zealand's a very small country. We don't have any other safeguard like an upper house. We do have a Westminster system, but it's a single house system. So Parliament can pretty much pass anything by a crude majority. And I think there's no doubt we've seen quite a lot of legislation that's been passed that doesn't reflect what New Zealanders would like to be happening in their country. So I think we are long overdue for some form of direct democracy, and for me that's binding referenda where the people can, if they feel like it, get together and have a say on an issue and make that a safeguard.
You mentioned to me once that the bottom line for any coalition agreement would be binding referenda. Is that still the case?
Yeah, look, it is, and the reason for that is that we think that the people of this country haven't spoken by referenda very often, but when they have, they've deserved to be listened to. And the case is simply a fact that they haven't been. Governments in this country don't like to be told what to do. When the legislation was put in place, originally it was drafted as binding, but the government at the time said, no government's ever going to ignore the wishes of the people, therefore we don't need to make it binding. Well, it turns out they were wrong, and I think we need to revisit it, as they promised we would, and simply introduce it as binding.
There are 4 parts to direct democracy as practiced in Switzerland: the constitutional referendum, the veto referendum, the citizens-initiated referendum, and the recall referendum. New Zealand uses only one aspect of this, the citizens-initiated referendum, and even then it isn't binding on the government. While New Zealand doesn't have a codified constitution to require constitutional referendums, as the leader of a new political party hoping to get into Parliament, do you see a need for the veto referendum and the recall referendum in New Zealand, and why do you think referendums should be binding on the New Zealand government?
I think what we need to do is start by fixing the one referendum option that we do have. So for me, first point of call is to actually say make our citizens initiate a referendum mean something and make them binding. Now, my view is we're not going to do that on a crude majority of 51%. I can accept that there needs to be a slightly higher threshold to iron out issues around, the nature of the question and so on. But nonetheless, what we do have, the one provision we do have, is simply meaningless, and governments have made it meaningless by ignoring it, referendum results. So I start with the one that we do have and say let's make that mean something. Let's make it actually have some validity. The other one that I would put high up the list is this idea of recall. We don't have that provision in our legislation, but we do definitely have representatives both at central government and local government level who have made promises to the electorate, who've campaigned on certain issues, and then when they've got into power, they simply haven't kept those promises. They've felt quite at liberty to break those, and there is no sort of comeback on them. There's no break that the public can put on them, and so essentially you've got to wait till the next election. So for me, there is a need for a recall referendum, and I'd use the example at the moment. We have a mayor in Auckland who decided to have an affair, but has also and used council facilities for that. But it's also now been shown that he did misuse certain benefits of his office. He took free upgrades from the casino in terms of rooms and other things. Now, at the moment, very few Aucklanders are comfortable with this guy being the mayor. But even though he's done all these things, there's no provision to stop him being mayor. We can't remove him. And he's refusing to go. He doesn't want to resign. And so I think that's a great example of the need for some sort of accountability around candidates, what they promise and then what they end up doing. Those two, for me, are the two that are most relevant. Constitutional referendum, I think occasionally we see the government throw one out to the people and, issues around how we run our democracy and so on. I actually think those are generally handled pretty well. Normally the government is guided by those. So I'm actually okay with that. And on the last one, veto referenda, I think it's one of those things that we have to have a public discussion on. But of course, if we have binding citizens referendum, well, if the citizens want to, they could propose this and actually bring in some form of veto referendum.
We have a referendum every 3 years when we elect members of parliament to represent us. Why do we need referendums, and why not simply let the professionals do their jobs?
This is an entertaining question actually, Steve, because I know the word of the use professionals. I would suggest that most of our politicians are not professionals. A number of them are activists. A number of them are people who simply have been voted to the position, but they haven't necessarily trained for this. They haven't necessarily gone out and got specific qualifications to somehow make them smarter than the rest of us. I think it comes back to this. We live in a democracy, and we have to decide what that means for us, New Zealanders. For me, it means that the people should actually be in the charge of our country, that the people are entitled from time to time to tell the government of our country what they want to happen, and the government, as servants of the people, should be expected to do it. Now, that's my view of how a good modern democracy should work. It is much easier now to hold referendum than it used to be. I think the ability to spread information about issues is so much more efficient than it used to be. We've got things like the internet, television, radio, all these mediums which actually make it a lot easier to convey information. So look, for me, I don't think that it's acceptable to have one referendum every 3 years that counts, but any one in between simply doesn't count. That's a double standard, unacceptable to me. And I point this out too, that when we have an election every 3 years, politicians make all these promises, but we have proven time and time again they don't keep them. And so for me, it's all very well to have a referendum where we elect these so-called professionals, but these are not people who keep their word. These are not people who stick to the party and policy platforms that they promised the electorate. And we simply need a safeguard. We simply need something that can protect what the people of this country actually want. It's about us having a nation that reflects what the public want it to be, instead of these professionals, so-called, who I look at most of the time as being activists or people who rather enjoy holding a position.
It's often said that voters are not competent enough to make good decisions in a referendum, and that they do not have the in-depth information that members of parliament have at their disposal. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I find it, again, look, it's a double standard, isn't it, to say that voters have enough intelligence every 3 years in a referendum to decide who their representatives are going to be, but suddenly don't have enough intelligence on any other issue. For me, that's simply an argument that doesn't hold any water. If it's an issue of making sure that people are informed enough to vote in referendum, I think we need to simply say that we have to make sure that the information is out there so that those who want to vote in the referendum can, and they can be fully informed. Look, other countries manage to do it very well. They manage to have referenda in which people, on a regular basis, in which people are informed and make informed decisions. I think it's a slight, maybe even more than that. I think it's outrageous that government can say, well, the people were very intelligent at election time, but lack intelligence the rest of the time. That's such an outrageous statement, and I think it reflects those who want to hold on to power and forget that they are servants of the public. And for me, they should always remember that they are servants of the public and our employees.
Opponents often argue that referendums would be a tyranny of the majority, harming minority rights and reducing civil rights. How would you answer this concern?
Well, I think that those opponents probably would benefit from opening a history book. History shows that the real tyranny is normally visited by despots, by dictators, by governments who gain totalitarian control. And if I look at the major civil rights movements around the world, what I see is that they began with the people. It was the politicians who were last to the cause. And I think that this is a very flawed argument, actually. I think history shows that people as a group are actually far more measured around these sorts of issues. It's people as a group who lobby for minority rights, and I think the history shows us very clearly you're much safer to put this sort of thing in the hands of the people rather than in the hands of a few.
But what about mob rule, Colin?
Well, again, I would say I don't believe that you've got any sort of substantial record in referendum anywhere in the world to show that mobs somehow are going to come in and dictate to some small hard done by minority. I mean, in a democracy, we do accept that the majority will have their say. That's what a democracy is. Essentially, it boils down to people having votes and deciding things through a discussion and through a forum where hopefully everyone engages intelligently. Now, I would argue that a public discussion is a far more intelligent debate than one held in the House of Representatives, usually under a lot of time pressure, and very often by people who haven't had time even to read the paperwork of what they're voting on. I think public discussions are very healthy, and I think that they actually temper those with very strong opinions in society because they're public discussions and it gives a chance for people to think clearly about things. I think if you look at the track record, the countries that have more referenda, that have more involvement of the people, have normally the best record in terms of how their people are treated, in terms of civil rights, and I think it's a stretch to say, look, the vast majority of people in society will do harm, but a small group of elite behind closed doors won't. Look, history shows every time it's the small group who have more power than they should who cause the problem. So I think this is a simple case of opening history books.
Unlike the parliamentary process, referendums do not allow for compromise. They are blunt yes or no instruments, even though they are on specific issues. How would you respond to this?
I think we have to accept that this is probably a fair criticism. Referenda are a question, a simple proposition that is put forward. But I'd point out that normally it is one single proposition, and so therefore having a discussion around one single proposition I don't think is problematic. It's the nuance, it's the behind the scenes that has to go on to implement law changes that I think does create some element of challenge with referenda. However, I think we need to accept democracy is not a perfect system. What we're trying to do as best as we can is make sure it is a perfect system that does ultimately give us a country that New Zealanders participate in, a country that's heading in the direction that New Zealanders want it to go, and a country that New Zealanders genuinely feel valued and they can belong to. So while this is probably a valid criticism, it certainly doesn't take away from the fact that a referenda, while a blunt tool, is nonetheless still a very valid tool in a modern democracy. And I'd point out that, the implementation of whatever the proposal is gives government the opportunity to fine-tune some of that detail behind the scenes. Yes, they've got to deliver on the basic proposition, but the mechanisms and the sort of the subtle political nuances behind the scenes, well, they can work that out. No one's trying to tell them how to do that. So I think it's not a major fault, but it probably is the one thing about referendums that I think it has some validity to question whether or not they can always be subtle or work conveniently with existing laws on related issues.
Referendums can slow the political process and disrupt a government's overall strategy. Wouldn't that be bad for society?
Look, I think this depends on your perspective. I would argue that, in fact, slowing the process down is a healthy thing to do. Most of the big mistakes that we've made in law in this country, we made because we were too quick to push something through. And probably the best example is when we lowered the drinking age. We took it down from 20 to 18. It was something the government did fairly quickly. It wasn't something the majority of the public wanted to happen. And by every measure, whether you're talking about the scientists, the doctors, those in social services, it's a bad law. It's done us a lot of harm. It's cost us a lot of money, and in some cases it's cost us lives of our people on the roads or through crime and violence. That's an example of a law getting passed far too quickly without the discussion and support of the people. So for me, look, slowing a process down or giving the public the ability to question a process, and remember that we don't do this very often. It's not like this happens every day in the week. We've had 5 in something over 20 years. Now, 1 every 4 years is hardly onerous on government. So at the end of the day, if government have to be slowed down every so often because the people of the country are not confident about moving forward on an issue, I think that's in fact good for our democratic process. If the public don't feel they've had enough discussion, or if the public feel the government's moving too fast or moving ahead on an agenda that they don't support, good on them for slowing it down and saying, hey, this is our country, can we please have a proper discussion? We would like to participate in the decision-making process. To me, that's a very big positive, not a negative.
It's a common belief that the public are irresponsible and will only support referendums that promise short-term benefits without considering the long-term costs. How do you see this?
Well, look, again, I would suggest that politicians have not proved that they're any more responsible than the rest of us. And in fact, I think there's a very good argument to say that more than anyone else, they are driven by very short-term considerations, i.e., am I going to get back into office 3 years from now? Now, I believe the public don't have that pressure on them. They're not looking to get elected 3 years from now. And therefore, I actually think that their decision-making and their consideration is actually much better structured and actually takes into account the long term far better than a politician who's got to think about getting re-elected in 2-3 years' time. So, look, I think that's a slight on the public. I think the public have proven that they're very measured. The discussions around referendum that we have in this country have been very good. They've been very robust. And I think the discussion has looked long-term. In fact, I would argue the public discussions around referendum in this country have always looked long-term and asked long-term questions. Whereas I think a lot of government policy and what government has enacted clearly does not. And we've seen examples of, things rushed through just before an election to give the government support. Cancelling interest on student loans was one of those. Introduced it in an election campaign to get somebody through. No thought of the long term. No thought that we would have billions and billions of dollars of uncollectible debt because there's no interest on it. No thought of whether it was actually fair to give a interest-free loan to somebody studying sociology at a university, but we won't do anything to help someone wanting an apprenticeship or starting a small business as a plumber, say. So I think if we look at the history of it, we get long-term and much broader discussions in a public debate when an issue is decided by the public than we ever do when the politicians are making the decisions by themselves behind closed doors.
People have a fear that special interest groups, wealthy individuals and the media will always decide the outcome of referendums. Are these fears warranted?
Look, I think in any democracy, regardless of whether it's politicians making decisions, whether it's the public making decisions, whether it's bureaucrat making decisions, special interest groups exist and they do exert quite a substantial influence. I would argue that in fact it's harder for special interest groups to capture the public than it is the balance of power in the House of Parliament. And again, I look at the alcohol legislation. We looked at reform of our alcohol laws recently. The public overwhelmingly wanted some reform. They overwhelmingly wanted to see particularly changes around tea and binge drinking and those sorts of things. The politicians themselves failed to deliver that. And they basically adopted, the majority of them adopted a sort of approach that said, the alcohol industry are pretty reasonable sorts of guys and they'll police themselves. Look, there are very few countries that buy that line, and certainly the public weren't buying it, but a small number of MPs clearly were. So I think it's actually naive to think that politicians, who are not very numerous, are immune somehow to interest groups and lobbying. I would argue that they are lobbied often and with frequency. I mean, look, I'm not even in Parliament yet, and yet I already have special interest groups and lobby groups who want to talk to me. That's because they understand all they've got to do is influence a few people. I think the more we have debates of significance in the public, the harder it becomes for these groups to actually influence outcome. And that's one of the good arguments for saying that big issues need to go to the public so that special interest groups can't simply get 10 people in their pocket and change the decision. They've now got to convince the population.
Some suggest that money will always buy a referendum. Is that the case?
Again, I think, let's simply look at the history of referenda. That's not true. California had one on marriage, right? Whether or not they would allow same-sex marriage. And it went to referendum. Those supporting the change outspent those opposing the change, I think, by 10 to 1. And they literally spent billions. I mean, it was massive campaigns. And they didn't succeed. The people of California voted to keep marriage between a man and a woman. So, look, there was more money than any other referenda that I know of was spent on that particular campaign to try to change the public's mind. The public did not change their mind. They decided they wanted to keep marriage the way it was. So I think an argument that says, well, money buys a referenda simply ignores the facts. The facts show that money doesn't buy a referenda. Good arguments might, good debate might, carefully building your case might, but I think those are all positive things in a democratic country. I think that good debate, good arguments deserve to win the day, but I would say very clearly history shows money just simply isn't enough to convince the people.
A referendum is estimated to cost between $10 and $20 million in New Zealand. Aren't referendums really too expensive? And how can you justify this cost when it could be spent on more hospital operations, for example?
Look, this is an often cited reason against referendums. But what cost democracy? What cost is it? How worthwhile is it to have a government that truly reflects what the people of the country want? And I remember asking the Swiss ambassador about the cost of referendum in Switzerland, because of course they have quite a few. And she said, who in Switzerland cares about the cost? It's about having a country that they feel they own, that they feel they can participate in, and knowing that the decisions have been well thought through, well debated, and genuinely reflect the public's best interest. And I think we need to adopt that attitude. I mean, we waste money on all sorts of other things all the time, and that's acceptable. I think this is not a waste of money. I think it goes to the heart of government. It goes to the heart of building a country where we have, in a mature way, talked about things in a public forum. And so for me, I see this as money very well spent. Money that ensures that we have more of a unity as a country, that we've debated issues, and it holds our parliamentarians to account. These are all such positive things that I think the cost associated with referendum is not the big issue. I do think we need to look at having them around elections if possible, and of course that sometimes politicians have deliberately bumped them so that they're not at election time, because they don't want it to have influence on an election. I don't believe that should be an option, actually. I think that if it falls, within 12 months of an election, I actually think it should be held at election time. And that way we are just reducing a little bit of the cost, getting a bit more of efficiency. And I have no issue with us debating big issues and making those part of an election debate. I think it's totally reasonable. Why not? So from my point of view, worth doing, always worth doing if the people say so. After all, it's their money. If they want to have one, they're entitled to spend their money on that.
There's justifiably been plenty of negative publicity in New Zealand, which has highlighted the poor wording of referendums, with some referendum questions being misleading and ambiguous. How would you overcome this problem?
Yeah, obviously the question in any sort of proposition or any sort of referendum is very important. What the Conservative Party has as policy is that referendum questions must be worded in the simple form and in the positive. So that way, if you support the proposal, then you vote yes. If you don't support it, then you vote no. That just keeps it nice and clear and simple. However, having said that, and although some of our questions haven't been ideal, it's very clear the public did understand them. I mean, nobody's got up afterwards and said, oh, by golly, I voted the wrong way because the question was confusing. By the time you've had a public debate, people do understand what it's about. They do understand whether they want to vote yes or they want to vote no. So, look, I think while we need to tidy up the questions, nonetheless, people have understood them. Once there's a debate, once there's a discussion going on, people get it. I mean, again, I just reject this idea that the public is somehow extremely dense and the politicians are somehow rather brilliant. That's not true. It's never been true. And people, once it's a public discussion, do get the gist of what the question's about.
Even though general elections do not have minimum thresholds or turnout requirements, some people feel that referendums should. What are your thoughts on that?
Referendums should. If you like, the control on whether or not a referendum should proceed is whether or not enough voters want to sign up and support the question being put to the people. So we have a safeguard. The way democracy works is those who don't care and don't bother to turn up and vote don't count. And they really have to accept the decision of those people who do participate in the process. Now, we accept that logic when we elect our government. We accept that logic when we elect our local governments, and many of those are very low turnouts. So I think it's consistent and absolutely right to accept the same logic with referendum, i.e. those who turn out and vote are the ones who will get to decide the issue.
And what about the percentage required for the referendum to be successful?
Well, look, for us, we've taken a position that where you get a substantial vote, and we've said 2/3, we believe there is no doubt what the people of the country want. Even if there's an argument, look, the question wasn't worded that well, or, someone ran a particularly good campaign for their argument. We believe a 2/3 majority of those voting is sufficient to be binding on government. We think anything less than that's informative. It should be taken into account by government, but we do believe that there needs to, at least at this stage, be some safeguard against a 50-50 decision. We believe a 50-50 or 55-45 decision still leaves room for government and elected officials to make a decision. But when it's an overwhelming result, a very substantial result, we just think it has to be binding.
Isn't that a little bit contradictory when considering we elect governments with less than 50% of the vote, but you expect 2/3 of the voters to make a decision in a referendum?
Yeah, look, it is a different standard, but we are actually talking about two different things. In an election, you're essentially voting for political parties. Those political parties have their platform out there, and like it or not, we need someone to lead the country. Now, we would like to think that they would build a consensus of more than 51%. Generally, they don't, and I think that's a shame, actually. I would like to see governments think far more about building, majority support. And by majority support, I mean, let's get 60, 70, 80% of people on board. Why can't we actually cross party boundaries and genuinely find consensus on issues? I think politics should be far more about consensus and less about division and cheap point scoring than it is right now. But I accept that you've got to have leadership. I accept that an election must give you an absolute result, and therefore you can't accept anything other than, well, 50% or 50.1% gives you the right to lead the country if you can get that many people together in a coalition. With referenda, I do think there are some factors that you can't necessarily always control for. And one of those is the question, one of those is how the debate's carried out, one of those is how well someone can resource their side of the argument. So I think it's a little difficult to argue at this point in time for a 50.1% result in a referendum to be binding. I think it's a step. I think it's a step to say we need to make these binding. I think most people would be comfortable with a 2/3 safeguard. And look, we can go further than that, but I think we've got to start somewhere, and for me, we've got to start by making them binding where there are actually clear results. And let's remember, everyone that's been held to date has had a clear result. So every single one of them would have been binding on the result that they achieved.
In Switzerland, they only require either 50,000 or 100,000 signatures to trigger a referendum, whereas in New Zealand, it's 10% of those registered on the Electoral roll, which is over 300,000 signatures. In your opinion, is this a reasonable amount? And if not, what amount would you consider reasonable?
Yeah, look, I think it's very unreasonable. The threshold we have is just far, far too high and very difficult to achieve. I believe what would be reasonable is to set it at 5% of those who voted in the last election. In New Zealand under MMP, 5% of those who vote is enough to get a political party into Parliament. It's a threshold that we already accept as being electorally significant, and I think that it makes absolute sense to have that as the same standard that you need to get a referendum in place. So if it's good enough to get a party into Parliament, that number of people, I think it's also good enough to get a referendum before the people of the country.
The 1986 New Zealand Royal Commission on the Electoral System didn't recommend referendums. In fact, they went as far to say that initiatives and referenda are blunt and crude devices which need to be used with care and circumspection. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I agree they need to be used with care and circumspection. And look, I think we accept that the one failing of referendums is they do have to be blunt. They have to be a simple question. So we accept that, not everything about them is 100% perfect. But what we're saying is it's better to have something of a safeguard there than it is to simply give politicians who won't always keep their promises free rein to do what they wish to do. The public need more ownership of the political process than that. So I agree with that statement. Yes, they can be a little bit blunt, and we do need to use them with care and circumspect in a circumspect way. But I believe we have. If you look at it, 5 referendums is hardly breaking the bank in over 20 years. So for me, I look at it, I think we have used them carefully and circumspectly. I don't think the process has ever really been abused at all. So for me, I think that we've kept that recommendation, and that recommendation is in play. I note that we didn't follow the recommendations of the Royal Commission in respect of other things like party threshold or whether or not there should be Maori seats. So I wonder, people who go back to that and draw on that, my first question is, well, we've kind of kept to that little bit of the Royal Commission. What about the things we blatantly ignored? Why don't we bring those into play? And I think we should start there rather than over-analysing whether every referendum has had enough circumspect behaviour. But I would argue they have.